Good evening, traveler. You've wandered into myth-taken dreams, a place where timelines tangle, truths wobble, and bedtime stories rewrite history just enough to make it magical. Each tale unfolds from a library that never existed, where historians whisper with poets and facts arrive fashionably late. Tonight, we unspool another tale from the flickering archive because bedtime deserves a version of history to pique the imagination. So fluff your pillow, turn down the logic, and lean into the lore. Once upon a time, in a world filled with mud huts, grass skirts, and the occasional confused-looking sheep, there was a very peculiar thing going on. People were starting to get really good at farming. I mean, they weren't just growing enough food to keep themselves fed, no. They were growing lots of food. So much food, in fact, that they didn't have to run around gathering berries or chasing after deer anymore. This was all very well and good if you were someone who liked sitting around and eating bread all day, but it posed a slight problem. You see, when people started growing enough food to last them through the winter and maybe even sell some of it on the side, because what else are you going to do when you have 100 bushels of grain and nowhere to store them? They needed somewhere to put it all. And while a hut is great for living in, it's not exactly optimal for storing vast quantities of wheat and dried fish. So people started building bigger things, houses, really big houses with more space for all their food. And once they had houses, well, they needed other houses for other people. And if you have a lot of houses, you start needing streets. And if you have streets, you start needing roads. And once you've got roads, you need gates to keep the sheep out. And before you know it, you've got yourself a city. Now, at first, these cities weren't what you'd call polished. In fact, some of them were rather rudimentary. They were full of people wandering about looking confused, wondering why it was so hard to find a spot for the goats. But that was the thing about cities. They were growing. And where there are people and goats and 100 bushels of wheat, someone is bound to start asking questions. Who owns the goats? Who's in charge of the wheat? And why does my neighbor's hut smell like garlic? It wasn't long before the people of these cities realized something important. They needed a way to keep track of things. Big things, like how much wheat was in the city's granary, who had borrowed that goat last Tuesday, and which family still owed a debt from last season's harvest. But you can't just remember all that, especially when there are goats involved, so they came up with an idea that was brilliant, and probably, at first, looked a little bit silly. They invented writing. Now, the first attempts at writing were not exactly what you'd call neat or tidy. In fact, they were more like squiggles and scratches made on clay tablets, or in some cases, the backs of very confused-looking goats. But, as is the way with all new things, it caught on. The people discovered that if you carved pictures into a tablet, like a picture of a goat, or a picture of a wheelbarrow, or a picture of, say, a very angry merchant, you could communicate ideas to other people who might not be standing right there. This was a bit of a breakthrough, you see. Instead of standing around shouting, "I swear I'll pay you back the wheat tomorrow," you could just write it down, and then everyone could refer to the little message whenever they liked. Imagine how much easier it would be to have a conversation with someone who couldn't hear you, or if you needed to send a message across town without having to carry it by hand. Write it down, and suddenly, boom, you've got communication that can last forever. Or, at least, until the clay tablet breaks, which happened a lot. So, as the cities grew bigger and bigger, so did the need for more organized systems. People started making laws like, "Don't eat someone else's goats," and "Please do not stand on other people's roofs during a rainstorm," and someone had to write them down. They started recording trade, keeping track of who owed whom a favor, and, very importantly, they began to tell stories. Big, grand stories about gods, heroes, and how the whole city was built from the sweat and determination of a very large group of people who had no idea what they were doing until they had to. And that's how the idea of writing and cities began to take shape. As you might guess, not everyone agreed on everything, but they all agreed on one thing. If you were going to make your mark on the world, or even just make sure no one forgets your name, you needed to be able to write it down. Now, it wasn't all easy, of course. People didn't just sit around scribbling for fun. Oh no. There was paper to be invented, and pens to be made, and calendars to figure out, because if you're going to keep track of who owes you what, you need to know when exactly they're supposed to give it back. But over time, the cities became less about scrambling for food and more about, well, everything else. They were places where people could make things, build things, and write down things that no one wanted to forget. They made up laws, created art, told stories, and, importantly, kept track of who had the most wheat. And as for writing, well, it didn't stop there. Over the years, people got better and better at it, inventing different alphabets, more complicated systems of scribbles, and eventually books, which are like the super fancy version of a tablet. They recorded everything, from how to plant wheat, to how to not trip over goats, to how the king's daughter ran off with the baker's son and caused an international incident. So, the cities grew and the writing grew with them, until you had entire libraries full of clever scribbles and shelves packed with the stories of people who had once lived in the very same cities, trying to make sense of this whole civilization business. And that, dear reader, is how cities rose up from humble beginnings, how writing began with a few squiggles in the dirt, and how both helped people keep track of their goats and, eventually, their dreams. The end, or rather, the beginning of the next chapter. Again,